A waitress, a ruthless millionaire, a grand piano. What started as humiliation turned into a moment no one saw coming. Can she turn the tables? Watch till the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The Waitress and the King of the Room. The warm hum of conversation filled La Fontaine, one of Raleigh, North Carolina's most exclusive fine dining establishments. Crystal glasses clinked, the scent of truffle risotto and aged wine lingered in the air, and a soft jazz melody floated from the grand piano tucked into the far corner of the room. Everything about the restaurant exuded wealth, class, and the kind of exclusivity that made regular people hesitate before stepping inside. To Emily Carter, however, this place was not a luxury, it was a battleground. Dressed in a crisp black uniform, her long auburn hair neatly tied back, Emily weaved between tables with effortless grace, balancing trays of overpriced entrees and expensive cocktails. She had worked at La Fontaine for almost 3 years, long enough to learn that the wealthiest customers often treated the staff as nothing more than background noise, faceless figures expected to serve without being seen. She had accepted that reality. After all, she wasn't here to be noticed, but tonight someone would notice her. Emily wasn't just a waitress, she was a pianist, a damn good one. Since she was a child, the piano had been her escape, her one constant in a life of instability. Growing up in a small southern town with a single mother who worked endless shifts as a nurse, Emily had learned early on that dreams didn't pay the bills. Their old secondhand piano, gifted by a kind-hearted neighbor, became her only luxury. She taught herself to play, mimicking songs from the radio and later tackling classical pieces with unmatched determination. By the time she was 17, she had dreams of attending a conservatory, of performing on grand stages where the world would finally hear her music. But life had other plans. Scholarships didn't come through. Rent needed to be paid. And so, instead of a conservatory, she ended up at La Fontaine, serving food to people who had never once worried about affording their dreams. Still, every night before closing, she would steal a few moments at the grand piano in the back lounge when no one was watching. It wasn't much, but it reminded her of who she really was. Tonight, however, Emily wasn't thinking about the piano. She was thinking about surviving another shift, about avoiding rude customers, collecting enough tips to cover her mother's medication, and making it home before exhaustion knocked her out completely. Then the door swung open, and Jonathan Hayes walked in. The air in the restaurant seemed to shift. Conversations faltered, waitstaff stood a little straighter, and diners instinctively turned their heads. Because when Jonathan Hayes entered a room, he owned it, or at least that's how he carried himself. Dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, his Rolex catching the chandelier's glow, Jonathan moved with the kind of arrogance that only came from never hearing the word no in his life. He was the type of man who thrived on spectacle, on making people uncomfortable just for the fun of it. At 41, he had built his reputation as a ruthless entrepreneur, founder of multiple companies, investor in half of Raleigh's upscale businesses, and, according to every gossip column, a man who enjoyed power as much as he enjoyed his whiskey. But among those who worked in the city's elite service industry, Jonathan was notorious. He wasn't just wealthy, he was cruel. He made a sport out of pushing people past their limits, taunting waiters, humiliating bartenders, and treating anyone he deemed beneath him as entertainment. And tonight, Emily Carter would be his next target. She didn't notice him at first, too busy clearing a nearby table. But the moment his piercing blue eyes landed on her, he smiled. Not a kind smile, not even a polite one. A smirk, like he had already decided she was a game he was going to play. Raising the stakes. Jonathan made his way to his usual VIP table, joined by 3 other men, equally polished, equally powerful, all of them feeding off his energy like satellites orbiting a dying star. Emily barely had time to process the shift in the room before one of the senior servers nudged her. "Hayes wants our best service," the server murmured under his breath, already retreating toward another table. "Be careful with him." She knew what that meant. Don't make a mistake. Don't let him get under your skin. And most importantly, don't react. As she walked toward his table, tray in hand, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. Look at that, he mused, his voice rich with condescension. Such grace. Are all the waitresses here this talented, or are you something special? His entourage chuckled, their laughter dripping with insincerity. Emily forced a neutral smile, the kind she had perfected over the years. What can I get for you tonight, sir? Jonathan tilted his head, pretending to consider her question. Hmm, how about something surprising? A bottle of your best wine, whatever you think I'd like. It was a test, she knew it, and she knew exactly what would happen next. If she suggested a wine that was too cheap, he'd laugh at her for assuming he had poor taste. If she picked one too expensive, he'd accuse her of trying to upsell him. There was no right answer. So instead, she simply said, "Of course. I'll bring it right away." Jonathan smirked, but he let her go. For now. As she walked away, she could feel his gaze burning into her back. And that's when she knew. Tonight wouldn't be a normal shift. Tonight, Jonathan Hayes had found his newest form of entertainment, and he wasn't going to stop until she broke. The cruel challenge. The air inside La Fontaine had shifted. The usual hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware, the soft jazz from the piano in the corner. It was all there, yet something felt off. It was the presence of Jonathan Hayes. Emily Carter had dealt with difficult customers before. She had handled rude remarks, impossible requests, and condescending tones that made her blood boil. But this was different. Jonathan wasn't just here to dine. He was here to play a game, one where the rules were his and the entertainment was her. As Emily returned to his table with the bottle of wine, she kept her expression neutral, her movements smooth and controlled. Don't give him a reason to push further. She poured a glass, steadying her hands as she felt his gaze follow her every movement. Ah, excellent choice, Jonathan mused, swirling the wine in his glass. He took a sip, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You know, Emily, I've always been fascinated by people like you. She didn't respond. People who work so hard day after day, he continued, tilting his head slightly, but never seem to move up. His entourage chuckled, and Emily felt her jaw tighten. She had been in this business long enough to recognize exactly what this was. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to get flustered, to snap, to give him an excuse to humiliate her further. So she simply smiled and said, "Would you like me to bring anything else for you, sir?" Jonathan's smirk widened. "Actually, yes, I would." He tapped a finger against the table, eyes flickering toward the grand piano in the corner of the restaurant. "I hear you play," he said casually. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how he knew. Maybe one of the other staff had mentioned it, or maybe he had overheard someone talking about it. But the way he said it, the mocking lilt in his voice, made her stomach churn. Jonathan leaned back, making a grand gesture toward the piano. "Why don't you give us a little performance?" The table fell silent. Nearby diners, who had been chatting amongst themselves, suddenly turned their heads. Even the other waitstaff hesitated mid-step, their eyes flickering between Jonathan and Emily. She felt a rush of heat in her face. I'm just working tonight," she said, forcing a polite chuckle. Jonathan feigned disappointment. "Oh, come on, what's the harm? Surely a pianist like yourself isn't afraid of a little audience?" His words slithered around her like a trap closing in. "I really shouldn't," she said carefully. Jonathan tisked. "That's a shame. I was hoping to be impressed. But I guess talent isn't as common as people like to think." Laughter erupted from his table. Emily's hands clenched at her sides. She could take the insult. She could take the humiliation. But there was something about the way he dismissed her, like she was insignificant, like she was a joke, that cut deep. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Never let someone make you feel small. You're bigger than they'll ever know." She lifted her chin slightly, looked Jonathan Hayes in the eye and said, "Fine." A flicker of surprise flashed across his face. He hadn't expected her to accept the challenge. Emily turned and walked toward the grand piano. But as she reached for the lid, she heard his voice again. "Wait." She froze. Jonathan leaned forward, an almost delighted expression on his face. "Let's make this interesting." A knot formed in Emily's stomach. "If you impress me, I'll leave the biggest tip you've ever seen." He took another slow sip of his wine. But if you don't, you have to do a shot with us. Right here, at this table. Laughter rippled through his entourage again. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew exactly what this was. He wasn't just challenging her to play, he was testing her boundaries. If she refused, he would call her a coward. If she lost, he would humiliate her even further, forcing her to sit at his table like she was part of his evening's entertainment. And if she won, she doubted Jonathan Hayes was a man who accepted defeat easily. The weight of every stare in the room pressed against her. She could feel the tension thick in the air, like the entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. And then she made her decision. Emily turned back toward the piano, took a seat and placed her fingers on the keys. The breaking point. The moment Emily's fingers touched the keys, the world around her faded. She played softly at first, easing into the melody, a delicate, haunting tune, one that carried pieces of her soul with every note. For a moment, the laughter at Jonathan's table died down. A few nearby diners turned their heads, intrigued. But Jonathan Hayes wasn't here to be enchanted. He was here to control the game, and he wasn't about to let her steal the spotlight. Emily had barely reached the second verse when a loud, deliberate sound shattered through the air. Clap. A slow, mocking clap. She flinched, her fingers faltering slightly. Jonathan, leaning back in his chair, smirked. His clap had been loud enough to disrupt the performance, but not enough to seem outright rude, just enough to get into her head. Not bad, he drawled. For a waitress. His entourage chuckled, their laughter cutting through the silence like a knife. Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening over the keys. She willed herself to keep going, to block him out. She picked up the melody again, playing with even more passion, pouring everything she had into the music. She refused to let him win. Jonathan's smirk twitched. He could feel the tide shifting. People were starting to listen to her. And that wouldn't do. He reached for his glass of scotch, swirled it lazily, then with a flick of his wrist, he spilled it. Right onto the floor. The crystal glass shattered against the marble tile. The sharp crash made Emily jump, the sudden noise jarring her concentration. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. A few servers rushed over, their expressions frozen between fear and disbelief. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Jonathan mused, feigning innocence as he locked eyes with Emily. "You should probably clean that up." His voice was smooth, casual, but Emily heard the underlying message loud and clear. "You are not important. You are a waitress. Remember your place." She felt a rush of heat crawl up her spine. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to ignore him, to keep playing, to finish what she started. But Jonathan wasn't done. Before she could react, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Actually, let's make this fair," he mused, "since we all know a performance is only as good as its audience." He turned to one of his companions, a man named Grant Reynolds, an investor, just as arrogant as Jonathan. "Grant, why don't you join her?" Jonathan's smirk widened. "Let's see if the waitress can keep up with a real pianist." Emily's stomach dropped. She knew the name Grant Reynolds. Unlike Jonathan, Grant actually was a trained pianist, one with years of classical training and a reputation for ruthlessly embarrassing amateurs. He smiled lazily, stretching his fingers. "Why not?" he said, standing up. "Let's give the crowd a show." The tension in the restaurant thickened. The other diners whispered amongst themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. Emily's heart pounded. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't challenged anyone. Jonathan had set her up. He didn't just want to humiliate her, he wanted to break her. Grant took a seat beside her at the piano, cracking his knuckles. "I'll start," he announced, then launched into a furiously complex classical piece, fast, technical, and overwhelming. His fingers moved like lightning over the keys. It was a deliberate power move, a challenge meant to bury her beneath his skill. And Jonathan? Jonathan was watching her, waiting for her to fail, waiting for her to break. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. This wasn't a game anymore. This was war. The turning point. Grant finished his piece with a flourish, lifting his hands dramatically as applause scattered through the room. Jonathan grinned. "Your turn, sweetheart." A hush fell over the restaurant. Every eye was on her. The pressure crushed down on her like a weight. She wasn't just playing a song anymore. She was fighting for her dignity. Emily exhaled slowly. Then she placed her hands on the keys. And she played. But she didn't try to match Grant's technicality. She didn't try to play faster or louder or more complex. Instead, she told a story. She played a song from her childhood, a piece filled with sorrow and longing. A melody that spoke of struggle and resilience, of nights spent practicing on an old out-of-tune piano, of dreams that had been postponed but never truly abandoned. And the room felt it. Slowly the energy shifted. The laughter died. The mockery faded. People listened. Even Grant's smug expression faltered. Because this wasn't just music. This was Emily, raw, vulnerable, unapologetically herself. And Jonathan Hayes, for the first time that night, he had nothing to say. The breaking of a king. As the final notes lingered in the air, the restaurant stood in stunned silence. Then, like a tidal wave, the applause erupted. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't obligatory appreciation. It was thunderous. Diners stood from their tables. Waitstaff peeked from the kitchen, grinning with pride. Even the pianist who had been playing jazz earlier looked at her with genuine respect. Emily sat still, her hands resting on the keys, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had taken back control. Jonathan's face was unreadable. His jaw was tight, his fingers drumming against the table. He had lost. He had thrown every obstacle in her way, taunts, distractions, even a seasoned pianist to humiliate her, and she had beaten him. Finally, he spoke. "Well," Jonathan said, his voice forced and clipped, "that was unexpected." He lifted his glass, but there was no smirk this time, no arrogance, only discomfort. Emily met his gaze. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "Thank you." A simple, deliberate response, because she knew it wasn't gratitude. It was a quiet victory, one that Jonathan Hayes would never forget. A door opens. The applause still thundered through La Fontaine. The restaurant, once filled with polite conversations and hushed elegance, had transformed into something else entirely, a standing ovation for a waitress who had just stolen the night. Emily Carter sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her pulse pounding like a drum. She had done it. She had walked straight into Jonathan Hayes' trap, into the impossible situation he had crafted, and instead of breaking, she had risen. And now she owned the room. Jonathan Hayes, the man who controlled everything, who commanded fear and obedience wherever he went, sat at his table in stunned silence. His smirk was gone. His usual air of unshakable confidence, shattered. His entourage, once laughing, drinking, basking in his arrogance, were now avoiding his gaze, shifting in their seats, unsure whether to pretend they hadn't just watched him lose or to acknowledge the unspoken reality. Jonathan Hayes had been outplayed. And Emily? She didn't even need to look at him, because at this moment, he didn't matter anymore. The final blow. Jonathan, still gripping his whiskey glass, cleared his throat and forced a slow, deliberate clap. "Impressive," he said, his voice smooth but stripped of its usual authority. Emily turned to him, expression unreadable. And then she smiled, not out of arrogance, not out of revenge, but out of knowing. Because no matter what Jonathan Hayes said next, she had already won. And Jonathan knew it too. He straightened his jacket, exhaling sharply, then signaled for the bill. His attempt to regain control of the situation was pathetic. A last-ditch effort to act as though this was just another night, just another dinner. But the energy in the room had changed. His power here? Gone. He placed his black Amex on the tray without a word. But just as Emily reached for it, Jonathan leaned in slightly, and in a voice only she could hear, murmured, "This doesn't change anything." Emily met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "It changes everything," she replied, just as softly. Jonathan held her stare for a second longer, then, with an unreadable expression, stood and walked out of the restaurant. His entourage scrambled after him, but they didn't laugh this time. And just like that, the king of the room left in disgrace. The moment that changed everything. As soon as the doors swung shut behind Jonathan, something else happened. A man, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored navy suit, stood up from a quiet corner of the restaurant. He had been watching the entire time, his expression unreadable, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. And now he was walking toward her. Emily, still trying to process everything, looked up as he approached. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, extending a business card. "Ethan Mitchell, producer, Nashville." Her breath caught. She recognized the name instantly. Ethan Mitchell, one of the most respected independent music producers in the country. He had worked with Grammy-winning artists, discovered rising talents, and built careers from the ground up. And now, he was standing in front of her. "That was, extraordinary," Ethan continued, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I haven't heard someone play with that much raw emotion in years." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Was this real? "I'd like to talk," Ethan said. "I'm not offering fame and fortune overnight, but I am offering a shot, if you're interested." Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the card. A shot. An actual chance to do something real with her music. "I—" She swallowed hard, still overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." Ethan smiled. "Say yes." The weight of a choice. The restaurant had returned to normal. The waitstaff moving through tables, customers resuming their meals. But for Emily Carter, everything had changed. She stood in the quiet back hallway, staring at the card in her hands, her mind racing. Was this real? Could she actually take this step? For years, she had buried her dreams beneath the weight of survival. She had told herself that music was a fantasy, that real life didn't make room for people like her to succeed. But now she had a choice. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to take it. She pulled out her phone, dialed the number, and as the line rang, a slow, determined smile crossed her face. This was only the beginning. The lesson in the music. Jonathan Hayes had walked into La Fontaine expecting to break someone. Instead, he had created something unstoppable. Because Emily Carter, she was no longer just a waitress with a forgotten dream. She was an artist, and no amount of power, money, or cruelty could take that away from her. The final thought, a message for you. The world is full of Jonathan Hayeses, people who will try to make you small, who will dismiss your dreams, who will push you down just to make themselves feel taller. But true strength, true power, it comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that from you. So ask yourself, what dream have you been holding back on? And what would happen if just once you stopped letting fear decide your future? Because tonight, Emily Carter did. And her story was just beginning. The end, or the beginning. Want more stories like this? Subscribe for more tales of resilience, triumph, and the power of never backing down.